Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first episode of Spirit Reflections in 2022. My name is Fred Gouveia. I'm your host, and tonight we have Dr. Humberto Schubert Coelho talking about the connections between spiritual emergence, mental health, and links to philosophy. And before we bring him on, I'm going to read his bio. And I would like to let you know that he has been with us on the channel in Portuguese last year. So I'll make a brief announcement in Portuguese about that. Para aqueles que já conhecem o professor Dr. Humberto Schubert Coelho, nós fizemos uma live com ele em português que está aqui embaixo na descrição do canal. Então fique à vontade de clicar lá. And we are going to be interviewing him soon, and I'll be getting him on the air now. And we'd like to invite you to subscribe and like our channel, Spirit Reflections. It's a bilingual community that brings people from all walks of life to talk about their personal and spiritual journeys and how they have found tools along the way that molded who they are and the work that they do today. And we have weekly podcasts and live YouTube sessions, both video and audio, in both Portuguese and English. And so we invite you to be part of this community, ask your questions, suggest guests, contents, and we can all grow from it together. And so I'm going to read about Humberto and NUPES, the Research Center on Spirituality and Health. So NUPES first. NUPES is an international research center of reference in spirituality and health. In addition to constant publication in scientific journals and books, conferences, and mentoring of graduate students, NUPES also provides updated and reliable information to the public through interviews and articles in lay media. NUPES was founded in 2007 and is integrated to the graduate program in health from the School of Medicine of the Federal University of Juiz de Fora in Minas Gerais, Brazil. There's also a link in our description of the website in English and the live that we're going to talk about of Dr. Alexander Moreira, which also discusses spirituality and mental health states. Now about Humberto. He is a lifelong member of the Brazilian Academy of Philosophy, he was just recently instated as a lifelong member, which is really exciting. He has a master's degree in philosophy from the Federal University of Juiz de Fora, which he got in 2007, and he did his doctorate in Science of Religion at the universities of both Juiz de Fora and Martin Luther Universität Halle in Germany. He has experience in the area of philosophy with an emphasis on philosophy of culture, metaphysics, ethics, and philosophy of religion, also dialoguing with systematic and philosophical aspects of theology and science of religion. In contributions to other disciplines, such as ethics and philosophy of culture, he remains interested in the unfolding of ontological and procedural aspects of metaphysics, particularly that of subjectivity in these practical spheres. That's a very complex bio, but I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that can connect with what Humberto is all about. And so without further ado, Humberto, good evening and welcome to the chat.
Hello, Fred. I'm very glad for being here with you for the first time in English and the second time in the show.
Beautiful. Thank you, Humberto. And let's get right to it. More and more, there's been research being done on the scientific realm about the connections on spiritual emergencies or emergences, spiritual awakening, and different mental health states. And I'd like to ask you, how have you been helping to get to more serious conclusions in the research realm with NUPES and how these can help us understand our states of mind better?
Great question. If you allow me a very brief historical introduction, I would like to refer to Stanislav Grof, the Czech psychologist, who coined the terms spiritual emergence as a sort of spiritual occurrence that changed people's lives, and spiritual emergencies, which refer more to the struggles and difficulties that people may experience in their spiritual lives? Well, I prefer William James, the great founder of scientific psychology, terminology, and approach to this subject. Well, William James, in his very famous Verities of Religious Experience, pretty much created the scientific approach to religion, ignoring the narrative-based perspective from believers, which also appear in theological discourse or even in sociological discourse, preferring instead of that a more evidence-based approach to the psychological side or the psychological aspect of such phenomena. So instead of speaking about what the believer claimed as an apparition or a mystical experience or a revelation, he focused his research on the psychological transformation that followed from that experience. So in his quite interesting analysis, and William James was a very empirical analyst of religions. He studied a medium, Eleanor Piper, for more than 20 years.
Right.
And mediumship in general for more than 20 years. And he concluded from that empirical observations that the psychological shifts and the transformation of consciousness experienced by many religious persons could be classified and analyzed in very specific patterns. And science is all about being capable of putting information in a lawful manner, in a lawful structure. So he identified the fundamental patterns behind religious experience as transformations in character, in our ways of viewing the world or interpreting the world and feeling the world. As we know, I'm more a philosopher than a scientist. Philosophers, and William James was also a philosopher to some extent, philosophers prefer to understand causation and explanation from the perspective of meaning and how activities can be regarded as meaningful or not. Well, he observed as an empirical researcher and a pragmatist, as a philosopher, that religious experiences were profoundly meaningful for those who had them, who experienced them. And even if we cannot, in no sense, know exactly what is going on, and we are allowed to have a materialistic approach to them and to consider them just psychological happenings and phenomena, we can have a more skeptical approach to them and say, well, it is impossible to tell, but something is going on here. Or we can have a transcendental or religious perspective, which considers the possibility that some spiritual phenomena is there in a more objective way, not only in a cultural or psychological way. Well, William James said, well, basically, the three options, the three possible ways of regarding this experience are irrelevant for our purpose because they are metaphysical. So they speak about the ultimate reality, and the role and the task of the scientist is not to make metaphysics, as many scientists unfortunately do. The task of scientists is to observe the data, the evidence, and to conclude what possible practical consequences this evidence may suggest or may enforce.
Right.
Now, William James said, for example, in his famous speech about faith healing or psychic healing, an issue that was very heated in all Western countries at the turn to the 20th century. He said that, well, it doesn't matter if something is happening in faith healing or not. The fact is that it cannot be possibly harmful. And if you're a materialist and you believe that absolutely nothing is happening when one prays, so you have more reason to consider prayer unharmful. So there is no rational reason, no reason to dismiss prayer as possible method of positive psychological stimulation to the patients. So either something is really happening in prayer or not. But if not, it is still preferable to pray if there is some positive psychological outcome of that. And if there is no psychological positive outcome and prayer is false and nothing is happening objectively, so even though no one could possibly criticize prayers or psychic healing because they do not change the patient in any harmful way.
Right.
So this is a very skeptical approach to the issue, and we have no reason to believe that William James was defending faith healing or psychic healing, or that he believed in that. But through a purely rational analysis, he concluded that it is irrational to reject a priori faith healing unless we have evidence that it is harmful.
Right.
The same thing happened in Brazil at the same time. And one of our colleagues, a historian, Angelica Almeida, wrote a book recently published called The Mad Factory.
The Mad Factory.
The Mad Factory, yes. Fábrica de Loucos in Portuguese.
Okay.
In the book, which corresponds to her PhD thesis here, her PhD research, she analyzes historical attacks from the medical community and from sanitary authorities to spiritualist and spiritist mediums. And it is a fact that many spiritualists and psychic healers and mediums at the time were persecuted and criminalized for their practices. And these practices were considered either demonic from Orthodox Catholic sanitary authorities, or fraudulent or like an illegal exercise of medicine from the more materialistic authorities. So, but from both perspectives, this should be eliminated. This should be fought in order to clean society and to clean Brazilian culture from this dissident or this non-conformist religious practice. Well, the same story happened in France. We have now this famous movie about that, the full the ball of the bulls, the ball of the mad women, which is an interesting French movie about the same issue in France also, in the turn to the 20th century.
Same time period.
And there is this link for Alexander's speech about the distinction between mental health issues and spiritual experiences, which is quite helpful because many people still believe that there is some mingling or some sort of confusion or even competition between them, while in fact both phenomena are quite distinct. In spiritual experiences, for example, we cannot find many evidence of harmful aspects of personality, or we cannot find actual detrimental mental conditions, and also the research on psychosis and schizophrenia shows that the auditory hallucinations and the visual hallucinations of psychotic people, they do not quite correspond to very complex interactions, which is what happens in apparitions of saints, angels, and spirits for those who have spiritual experiences. So,
in other words, all of these supposed spiritual interventions, interactions, effects that were felt by these mental health patients didn't necessarily, those were not necessarily proved to be what caused them to be imbalanced or unstable. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yes, in fact, not only there is no strong correlation between mental health issues and mental disease and spiritual experiences. They do not usually come together.
Understood.
They tend to be separated.
Understood.
Very far apart.
In fact, as you're talking about this, Humberto, I just want to once again remind people that at the bottom of the description of this podcast, there is this link by Dr. Alexander Moreira, a 7-minute video on YouTube, which also talks about these differential experiences from mental disorders versus spiritual experiences. So check it out at the bottom of this email.
Yeah, and he does it in a very technical way because he's a psychiatrist. Not only these phenomena are very different from each other, but also there is a tendency. We have strong evidence to support a tendency to of the spiritual experiences to be more positive,
right,
and to be helpful in many ways, like enforcing character traits and virtues, for example, and even in helping to fight mental disease and so.
Beautiful.
But obviously, research on this is still very in the beginning, because not only there is some taboo
Right.
about the connections between spirituality and science, but
Hmm.
also many scientists still believe that philosophically believe that science should be materialistic,
Right.
which is in fact a metaphysical and purely philosophical conception or belief. When we speak about the purpose of science, what is science for, or the ultimate reality, we are always speaking about metaphysics, about what is behind the observable world.
Right.
But when we try to speak scientifically, we have to speak about what is in front of us, what is observable in the natural world. So our conclusions and judgments about the ultimate reality of what is possible or not, they are never scientific opinions. They are purely philosophical opinions.
Indeed. And there's also a kind of a mental health crisis in the world right now, other than the pandemic which we're in. And it seems to me that it has driven a lot of people to further explore potential spiritual experiences. And in that regard, I find that Brazil specifically has a leg up in a way, since a lot of the psychiatric hospitals there tend to be more open-minded to exploring complementary spiritual therapies, specifically spiritist therapies. And there's a data point which I thought was pretty fascinating that Dr. Humberto gave on. He's a psychiatrist and has been a director and involved for more than 40 years at the André Luiz Spiritist Psychiatric Hospital in Belo Horizonte, Brazil, one of the most renowned and important psychiatric institutions in the whole country. And he said in our conversation that about 100 of all the psychiatric institutions in Brazil, which he said that there's only about 100 of them, he said like 95 of them are either funded or run or supported by spiritist or spiritist sympathizing organizations. And that took me aback to see how large that number was. And so I find that within the spiritist science, there's seems to be a greater sensitivity, at least, to welcoming and wanting to help the mental health patient and their families to bridge, in a way, this gap between a mental health state that's balanced and healthy with an understanding of the spiritual causes potentially behind their states and their condition, right?
Yeah. On one hand, as William James argued very competently, it is irrational and even unscientific to deny people spiritual alternative treatment based on our prejudice against it.
Right.
So if it's not in competition with medical treatment, which is almost never the case, so why could it be possibly harmful? But on the other hand, we also have consistent evidence in favor of spiritual experiences and even spiritual treatment. And many researchers show that it can have at least a psychological positive effect on people. So from Alistair Hardy, Oxford's biologist, to more recently Tyler Van der Wiel, Harvard social quantitative scientist, we have a very broad spectrum of works in all possible areas of medicine, social sciences, psychology, even applied theology nowadays, that suggest or that collected evidence suggestive of positive psychological aspects and social positive influence of religious experiences. Religious experiences or spiritual experiences are very broad terms.
Right.
That's a problem when we are talking about them. They can mean, for example, attending a place of worship, or they can mean a more specific psychological occurrence or even a psychological transformation.
Or even engaging in like altered states of consciousness to trance,
Exactly.
either induced by substances or induced by suggestive hypnosis of a crowd or mantras, right? So there's all kinds of religious experiences that this term can convey, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, breath techniques and meditation, prayer. Well, obviously, we do not know why and not quite exactly how it happens, but these many different spiritual experiences, they deeply affect
Right.
human behavior and human nature, and they do not seem to be easily reduced to external facts or conditions, such as usually people refer to delusions or
Right.
social influence or cultural influence, traditions, and so on. In the human sciences, especially, and I am from the humanities, I am myself in that field more than in the natural sciences. Uh, Although I'm interested in analyzing the data from the natural sciences. Well, in the humanities, people nowadays, in the last century or so, they developed a very, very strong belief about the complete power and the overwhelming power of cultural tendencies and the influence of tradition, symbols,
Right.
ideas, customs, and so. Well, as it is obviously true to some extent, we cannot reduce everything to that too, to the level of denying empirical evidence from the natural world.
Right. I wondered, Humberto, if you could speak a little bit about mediumship specifically in the research. You've been involved at the Research Center on Spirituality and Health.
Yeah. Well, research on mediumship is now, so to say, in the beginning. We have more objective data about the belief of the population about spiritual experiences. But there are many different research because the group, the center is very large, and we have a very diversified group of people from many different backgrounds. We have atheists and Catholics, evangelical, spiritists, Umbandists, which is Afro-Brazilian religion, and I believe there was at some point a Buddhist too. More recently, there is a colleague, a contributor who is a Jew. So it's a very diversified group. So we try to analyze everything that can be possibly interesting and challenging in matters of evidence. But
Okay.
research on mediumship has shown that, for example, the brain areas responsible for imagination, which was assumed previously to be responsible for mediumistic trance, was actually not active during mediumistic trance and automatic.
I believe that's the frontal part of our brain, correct?
Yes, I think so. It is the more active and intentional and imaginative part. What was actually more active in these automatic writings were not the parts that should be responsible for writing, but more primitive parts of the brain.
Interesting. So, in other words, in automatic writing, sometimes is also referred to as psychography, when the medium goes into a trance state of some depth, the medium then supposedly is receiving written communication in writing from some other dimension. The part that the brain would normally attribute to the writing function was observed through imaging, that in fact when those mediums were in the deep trance, that part was not as activated as when they were in a controlled setting, just writing normally, not in the trance state, correct?
Yes, it's very common that in neuroimagery we have some tricky results from what we expected to find active in some tasks, and what actually happens to be active when we are scanning the brain. And that research specifically was very interesting because it suggested that further research should be made in order to explain what was happening in automatic writing or in mediumship in general.
And what other research projects is NUPES currently involved, that you are personally involved in, that you'd want to share some more details as they pertain to the topic on mental health and spirituality?
I'm personally more involved in the humanistic branch of NUPES, which sometimes interprets the data from the natural scientists.
Okay.
And sometimes we have a more historical approach to what other researchers did in the past. Could be psychic researchers or psychologists. We have works on Carl Gustav Jung, William James, for example.
Wonderful.
Or scientists of religion, or specialists in religious studies, or even philosophers and theologians. All these intellectuals or researchers, they try to explain religious phenomena or spiritual phenomena in some way. Most of them from a more cultural perspective, from a more cultural approach. Well, I personally, I have an idea about the best way of explaining what is happening in the religious or the spiritual.
Yeah, let's dive into that, the philosophical, the humanistic side of it.
Okay, there's a great book from Ian McGilchrist entitled the master and his emissary.
The master and his emissary.
Yeah, it's masterfully written.
Ian McGilchrist?
Yes, Ian
Okay.
McGilchrist.
All right, we'll put it here in the comments and description.
And the book is about how the division of the brain into hemispheres and the specialization of the brain in different functions, even if obviously this specialization is not as the stereotype in popular culture depicts it.
As a left brain, right brain more creative, left brain more logical, and that kind of thing.
We have
I see.
self-help books and popular psychology books that reduce things a little bit and make it quite plain, while in fact it is a very, very complex issue that very few people dare to claim to understand.
Mm-hmm.
And McGilchrist is probably one of the very few real masters in this area, because he has a vast philosophical and artistic knowledge, while being also a neuroscientist. So he could competently connect natural sciences approach to the brain and to the mind to the more humanistic approach to the mind or to culture. Well, he concluded that even if the stereotype or the caricature is gross and simplistic, the division of the hemispheres does play a role in the way we think. Well, during the entire history of philosophy, we identify people who say that there is a split between analytical mind and literary, contextual, or religious mind or tendency. We have the famous Blaise Pascal's quote about the spirit of mathematician, the spirit of sensibility and subtlety. We have William James' division or typology of the dominant personalities as the tough-minded and the tender-minded. So in all
Humberto, I wouldn't want to break your thought, but I wanted to read out the quote by Blaise Pascal that you've referenced. Is it? Could you say that again? And I'm gonna find it.
There is the spirit of the geometrist and the spirit of finesse. Maybe
okay.
It's understandable in English. I'm not sure, but I would call it more or less a spirit of subtlety or something like that.
Got it.
Which is more humanistic and religious or mystic and poetic.
Okay. Well, I will figure it out which ones, and I'm looking at here several of his quotes, and we'll reference that later. Okay, let's keep going.
Well, in all these typologies, in these dualistic understandings of the ways mind works, or the analytic and the synthetic, and so on, the analytic and the romantic. What is at stake is basically the division of functions that follow the division of the hemispheres and the specialization of the hemispheres in performing very specific and isolated functions. So we can make it easier through an example. A bird in a park, for example, is performing a very specific task of collecting seeds, picking seeds from the grass. Well, the bird does not care much about the dog barking far away, or the child laughing, or the cloudy sky. It's
Right.
not. Uh, it's not what he cares about.
It's not perceiving, registering those influences.
His mind has to be focused on the seeds, the distance, and how many steps I have to make until the next seed, and so and so. Do I need another one, or it is enough?
Right.
It is a very simple task. It's the task of the mathematician, the engineer, or the bureaucrat with tables, organizing what goes here, and very specific, objective things. But another part of the bird's brain has to be a bit aware to the environment, because it is dangerous. It can be bad for its survival, to be unaware of a storm coming or a predator. And the right hemisphere, or the less analytical and a bit more contextual environmental part of the brain, dedicates itself to processing this data unconsciously. So the bird has very vague ideas about what is not a seed on the grass.
So the more circumstantial, abstract gets processed mainly through the right hemisphere, and it goes more on a subconscious level, right?
Yes, because it could be evolutionarily interesting for the bird to know about a possible mate, or a threat to its existence, death threat, and so. But it's not the immediate task of the bird. So he transferred this other tasks to the right hemisphere, which is specialized in analyzing many different things in context. It's more semantic.
Right.
It interprets what is happening and gives us vague ideas about what's the point of it, what's the purpose of our life, and so and so. Well, we usually in our culture, we call this more vague contextual semantic ideas art, religion, mystic experiences, charisma. When we see a politician, and the politician is not giving you any objective information of anything. She or he is not telling you how she or he will solve the problem objectively, but you just feel that the politician is trustworthy. And this vague feeling, or this context way of thinking, is more related to the right hemisphere of the brain. So McGilchrist concludes, or at least argues, that the right hemisphere of the brain should have the greater control of our lives, because the left hemisphere of the brain, the analytical hemisphere that deals with tables and schedules and precision of millimeters and grams and seconds and so on. This part of the brain, or the function of analysis and separating and very careful and clear understanding of the parts, it is blind for the whole, for the purpose for the context. So when people say that poetry, religion, or politics is irrelevant because it's not plain analytical or scientific or anything like that, they are actually blinding themselves for the fact that this is a great part of our lives and possibly the part that gives us directions in life. Well, but this is a caricature.
Right.
The opposite caricature or the opposite extreme is the dreamy and
Right.
gloomy mystic that is all crystals and cares only about what is subtle, contextual,
Right.
sentimental.
The diaphanous, the
But
imprecise.
this
Right.
is objective information, and this person can be very easily tricked by superstitions, wishful thinking, and misconceptions.
Right.
Because to have clear conceptions of things is fundamental. We need clear conceptions of many things, mostly practical things, objective things. So obviously, as Pascal said, or Plato and Aristotle, much before him, we need both functions in harmony and not blinding ourselves to one function in favor of the other. But the point is that it is difficult to use both functions in harmony. So we have a natural tendency that is not only a psychological tendency, but a neurological tendency. So it's maybe a physical effort to think as a whole, to think more holistically,
Right.
to integrate the more
To connect the dots and always be seeing the bigger picture at the same time that you're calculating your steps to the next seed, so to speak, right? With those in
Yes.
harmony.
It is, well, we can see it in different ways, and I do not claim to have an integrative mind,
Right.
but maybe we should ask Goethe or Pascal. But probably it has to do with going to one function and then the other all the time.
Right. Right.
You have to reflect about the ultimate meaning and purpose of what you're doing, and what is the point of all that,
Exactly.
and how do you integrate that in a worldview, for example. You don't need to be religious or artistic, but you have somehow you have to integrate it in
Right.
a meaningful big picture.
So
at the
it's
same
almost
time,
at the same time. Go ahead.
you have to competently deal with very specific and practical tasks that constitute the majority of our professional and practical lives. For example, you have to tell people what to do, or you have to drive from one point to the other, and in that very specific tasks, you have to be competent, and
Right.
you have to successfully complete an objective task.
Yeah, it's almost balancing out the polar opposites and making sure that you have a clear awareness and understanding that even though they are polar opposites, paradoxically they're one and the same. And the famous treading the path of the middle seems to be what the philosophers you quoted have recommended that we strive towards. And when you mentioned the word integrative, it reminded me of a conversation I had here on the channel last year with Dr. Emma Bragdon, and I actually put this link also in the description of this show, a conversation I had with her last year about spiritual awakening and mental health, in which she also goes at length, not only describing the experiences that the many field trips she took to Brazil with academics and doctors and observers, but she also has a great portal online called Integrative Mental Health University, imhu.org, where she offers courses and trainings to exactly help us bridge more these gaps of the polar opposites, if you will, and be able to understand how we can find that balance within. And I'm also mentioning her because we might be doing something in the future here on the channel about deepening our understanding of mediumship training so that it can be better understood for people to use it in a therapeutic, quote unquote, way to help balance, I'd say, these forces, right?
Yeah, we have this more recent researches on spirituality, spirituality and health, on religion, religious experiences. But actually, this comes from the founding of Western culture, from civilization in general. I speak about the Western culture because I studied a bit more about that. But Plato, for example, was the founder of rational thinking, and he was quite a mystic to some extent, or a religious man, obviously, and that deeply borders some scientists or some object-oriented minds that prefer to deny the integration of the aspects of life. But another problem in this issue is that people usually associate spiritual or religious mentality to religions or to very specific doctrines or sets of beliefs.
Dogmas, right?
Exactly, and behaviors and behavioral control, actually, and historical persecutions and the historical deeds of specific religions. Well, when you enter that realm, it's really a mess, because we are in the realm of social facts. Social facts are caused by people. People are a mess. They have all sorts of intentions, purposes, feelings. Sometimes they are in plain contradiction with themselves, with their most valuable beliefs, and so sometimes they are not in contradiction, but they are fooled or deluded or simply ignorant. And if we analyze culture, society, institutions, or doctrine as sources of our concepts and our terminology to describe religion, we end up with a very problematic and very messy picture. So what scientists try to do more recently since William James or so, is to isolate what I said in the very beginning of our conversation, the more patterned phenomena that you can isolate as a natural law. And from that natural patterns of evidence of phenomena that can be analyzed, we infer some things that could or not correspond to religious doctrine and to religious conceptions in general.
Yeah, I think that's where the power of art in all of its manifestations, be it poetry, dance, music, visual art, can be a great mirror for social conversations that allow us to look at ourselves today and compare it with few generations ago and see the different moments and the ebbs and flows of different periods of time in history that have cumulatively brought us to where we are today, and we are heirs of all of that baggage, collectively speaking. And when you bring references from ancient Greece, from Plato, for example, we see how they're so current to this day. And one of the things we are going to experiment here on the channel this year is to invite people to have more experiential immersions by using art, poetry, music, and make them be more subjective to the interpretation of it and more broad and open, so that the experience can be felt at the time by this community, and whatever arises as a result of it, which we can say a religious experience or not, will be interpreted individually afterwards. And the point will be just a coming together using the tools of art to promote a deeper spiritual experience or religious experience, to stay to the terminology that we've talked about in the beginning here of William James. So I'm excited for those experiments, and stay tuned. We'll let you know in the channel. And also William James specifically, right, Humberto, we're going to, in a few months from now, have a conversation, the three of us, you, myself, and a surprise guest who is a scholar on William James. And we hope to deepen ourselves into the philosophy of William James, his thinking, how it influenced the historical period in the United States and the great minds of the world at the time, and how we can draw maybe some parallels of conclusions perhaps to today's practical reality. So stay tuned for that. I wanted to offer you a chance to give some final thoughts to us, and for us to close tonight's reflections, and then we can call it an evening.
Yeah, great. Well, even non-religious thinkers such as Friedrich Nietzsche and Alain de Botton, they stressed that art could substitute religion as a means to spiritual accomplishment, to spiritual experiences. I would add to that sociability. I usually use the term politics, which is not adequate, but sociability includes politics, social action, and the very basic social interrelations we have with other people, interpersonal relationships, from a couple and 2 or 3 friends to very large social movements, or to politics itself. We can say that these human interactions, or these interpersonal experiences, they can be quite transformative and powerful. And to some extent, we can also understand them as spiritual experiences. So I would resume spiritual experiences or spirituality in these 3 forms.
Like synthesize it, right, in 3 forms.
Yes, art, religion, sociability.
Art, religion, sociability.
Yeah, which is exactly what Hegel, the greatest idealist philosopher, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, called the manifestations of the spirit.
Okay.
He meant by spirit more or less culture, but
our creative, intelligent drive to produce what we see as the human experience.
Yes.
Religion, art, and sociability.
Yes. The ways to provide meaningful life.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, this was a really insightful conversation. I'm really pleased we had a chance to have it here on the air. I'd like to invite everybody to subscribe to our channel. Stay tuned for future episodes. If you have any specific feedback you'd like to provide, write us an email to info@spiritreflections.org. And we will continue to be broadcasting these conversations around the fire, and we invite you to be a part of the community. Humberto, thank you very much for opening our 2022 season of conversations around the fire with this really cool conversation. And here's also a possibility for us to maybe in the future have a couple more conversations specifically on philosophers that you like the most, like Hegel and Goethe and others like Nietzsche, who are very influential in Western civilization, and we can have these kinds of formats around the fire for us to deepen ourselves in the branch of philosophy. So
that would be great.
Wonderful. All right, everybody, have a good evening, and we will see you in the next episode. Thank you.